Welcome, everyone. I am Enrique Acosta Gonzales, and I am joined by Ashkan Tashvir. And in this episode, we will be speaking about resilience in leadership, beyond endurance, a being centered approach. Now, Ashkan, in a world that is plagued with trouble, resiliency is so needed, especially for those in leadership. So I can't wait to get into this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Enrique, for being with me one more time. And thank you, everyone, for following our videos. So, so we're going to talk about resilience today. But as always, I think it's a good idea to create a context. Yeah. So let's look into the nature of life. Um, the moment that you talk about nature of life, and some people may already oppose that kind of terminology because um, uh, what our understanding of nature of life is can seem quite subjective, but I try to do my best to talk about the bits that I think phenomenologically um, m- most of us human beings can easily relate. You know, these are like common human experiences. We are vulnerable, and this is not the first time in this series we're talking about this. We are vulnerable. We're vulnerable to a 20-gram projectile. We're vulnerable to diseases, to certain microorganisms that we can barely see them. We are vulnerable to viruses. We're vulnerable to our cheating partner, our angry neighbor. We're vulnerable to the neighbor country who dares to want to occupy a piece of our land. We're vulnerable to our competitors in the market that they don't really like to see us there having a good amount of the share in that market and be profitable. So we're vulnerable also to our own desires and temptations and impulses. For example, our vulnerability to not being able to control ourselves if we really like sweets with the sugar or so on and so forth. So we are indeed vulnerable, and that vulnerability lead to this mood or state of mind of anxiety. Not anxiety necessarily as a negative, with a negative connotation. We're not talking about anxiety disorder, but anxiety as this state of mind, as this way that we disclose ourselves and interact with the world. Now, so there's plenty subject matter. There's plenty matters that comes on our way that they can easily um, crush us. We can easily feel crushed or be crushed under um, um, the influence of all of these matters that happens. And in many cases, we have very limited control or no control. Yeah. Now, when you are dealing with this vulnerability and anxiety, going through what ifs, dealing with the matters that life brings to you that you may not have any control over, it's easy to relate to life as a burden. Life becomes a burden. The experience of life becomes a burden that you need to carry. Now, what would be our response to to this is going to basically determines in great part the quality of our life or the quality of the experience of life. So, and we clearly know that like similar matters, similar things happen to different people, and different people respond differently. So it is possible, yeah, it is possible to be responsible. That's another piece that it's an ontological reality of us human beings. No one can say that I'm not vulnerable. No one can say that I don't deal with anxieties. And no one can say that I'm not responsible. When we're talking about being response able, is like being able to respond to the matters that life brings to us, regardless of the source. So we want to be the active agent. We want to be the primary cause of these matters, in responding to these matters, and that's exactly where resilience matters. See, we can easily be crushed if you're not resilient. So, but often when we talk about resilience, um, the most immediate thing that comes to mind is endurance, or enduring the difficulties. But just to make it clear, like what our distinction is when we're talking about resilience here in this conversation, at least on my part, we're not talking about just enduring uh, difficulties or toughness, as basically what Oxford Dictionary says, like in one of the definitions of the word resilience. We're not necessarily talking about toughness. In the contrary, we are focusing on this other part of the definition that the Oxford Dictionary has, and I let me read it. Like it says, the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties. That's basically what we're talking about here. So life is going to take you over. These matters in life is going to stretch you. It's going to push you so that you're not in your stable position. The thing is, are you capable of bouncing back? Do you have that level of elasticity so that then you can recover, and not only recover to your original shape, but perhaps even more strong and the more robust way you can become. So that's basically um, what we mean with resilience. So let me ask you this question, Enrique. We created the context. We touched on like a quite high level on what we mean by resilience. Um, why do you think that resilience matters? Let's just talk about the why.
Well, resilience matters because if we are not able to get into a position in our lives where we can quickly adjust, overcome, and continue our journey, we will collapse. You know, there
Mm,
will be not only physical impairments, but there can be emotional impairments. They can even be sometimes life threatening situations if you're not able to do that. So, in the long run, as a human, you want to be able to, like you said, respond, be able to
mm,
respond to the different things that come at us so that we are not basically at the mercy of whatever comes our way.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so very, very tangible things like, for example, you're going to be, if you're up to a big cause in life, you're going to be criticized. And many times these criticisms that are being drawn to you may not even bind, may not even be relevant. But they have their impact. Like, you're going to develop your ability um, to be able to withstand this harsh criticism and yet move ahead. And that requires a tremendous amount of courage and many more qualities. But so resilience in this context is not just being flexible. See, you can be flexible, and that also is a very important quality to have. But when we're talking about resilience, we're not just talking about being flexible, but the ability to bounce back, really, to go into your original shape. And yeah, as you said it, like if we don't, if you're not resilient, then we're going to be crushed. We're going to be crushed. So now let's look into some of the tangible examples. What comes to your mind, Enrique? Like, where exactly you you think that we need resilience?
Well, I'll give you an example with me.
Okay.
In 2021, my mother passed from COVID. I did not know, nor did I anticipate that occurrence, that event was going to shatter me. I
Mm,
thought that after working in an environment where I was always notifying people of deaths in the
mm,
military, where I was a representative at different events where people lost their lives, doing
mm,
investigations and reports. I thought that when that time would come, that it would be just something that I had already built resiliency around,
mm,
except that it completely buckled me.
mm,
It floored me. I had to make a decision to quit my job because my mind was nowhere to be found. I
mm,
was not understanding why I couldn't comprehend simple things, but it
mm,
was because I was going and undergoing a
mm,
severe trauma internally that I thought was going to be externally all the way. And so what happened to me was that event completely shook my resiliency that I had already built around death because it
mm.
was home, right?
Yeah,
It was a different aspect. And I had to quit my job because I just could not perform.
yeah, yeah. And this what you just brought up, like, yeah, they definitely, like, it can be quite severe considering the person who gave birth to you, who gave you the existence that you have, your very existence is not going to be there anymore. And yeah, so yeah, so that's an example. That's a very good example that use it, like, if that resilience is not there, we can literally collapse. Yeah. Now, um, I'm actually, now that you're talking about it, I'm just trying to picture that and then see how bad it can be. But then you have no way but to surrender, logically. Now, intellectually, it's understandable, but that, as you said, like, you didn't expect uh, that shattering experience. Yeah. Now, matters of that kind um, are a lot. Like, many things like this can happen in life that it can actually take us completely away from our original form. Let's assume that we have a relatively high degree of integrity, that we have our bits and pieces together. But then things happen, and then you're going to be dismantled. You're going to be, like, all each of your parts are going to go in one way, and then you need to pull yourself back together. And that's exactly what we mean by um, um, resilience. Now, so if you look into the main causes of death in us human beings, the number one that shows up is cardiovascular issues. And then when you dig deeper and then you look into what's the number one perhaps cause that it leads to cardiovascular issues is chronic stress. So it's a very important way to look at it, and seeing that, like, um, the state of our mind and our mood can have a direct correlation to death, to getting, like, severe health issues. And so this is the relationship with our eye, mind, and body. Now, and that's exactly where resilience needs to play its role. Now, we see that in today's society, especially at college campuses or in the schools, there are conversations around emotional safety, for example. Yeah. We have introduced safe workplaces. We have introduced ideas around trigger-free zones in at universities and things of that kind. And while, like, it can be considered a very benevolent cause, We don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. We don't want to anyone feel threatened or. But then in reality, the complexity of the issue is way more than what we may assume. The assumptions, the very assumptions that are leading to the creation of such constructs, yeah. Because, for example, like there's this massive level of subjectivity when it comes to what exactly make this particular person feel triggered, and what exactly make this person, this unique person, feel um, feel uncomfortable, or are the questions like, are they very objective, are there a very objective list of what constitutes bullying, yeah. So people get offended with very, very different things, depends of who they are, how they are, and their life experiences and so on, what I refer to as their existing meta content, their what they know things are and how they think things work, and so on, their narrative and their interpretations of their experiences in life. So now in that, I think that the more realistic approach is like, see, while we can try to do our best and reduce the amount of bullying and creating safe spaces, etc., etc., the reality is you cannot completely eradicate every possible thing that it may make someone feel threatened, uncomfortable, or offended. And that's exactly why we think that the better alternative is developing emotional resilience, or resilience in general, meaning that you live life from this viewpoint and you have this credible view of the world, congruent view of the world, that yes, despite all we do, despite our policies and judiciary system and civil laws, etc., etc., there are going to be the ones amongst us that are going to treat me unfairly. They're going to have harsh criticism towards me. They're going to misjudge me. They're going to do certain things or say certain things that I'm going to severely feel offended and uncomfortable and irritated. What to do about that? Because see, if you're leaving from this viewpoint that you can or you should um, enforce certain behaviors or force others to behave in certain manners or compel other people's languages so that then you feel okay. And then if everyone wants to do that, that's mathematically impossible. So while education around those matters are important, but at the end of the day, you cannot stop everyone else's freedom of expression, freedom of speech, or compel other people's language, or impose certain harsh rules on and limiting people's behavior just for you to feel okay. So that's exactly where we need to look into where our power resides, where the power resides. And that's exactly where, that's exactly where we need to talk about resilience, because you have very limited control over how others behave and what others say, but you have tremendous amount of control and influence on what you say and how you respond to matters. Certain times, basically, you just want to ignore. Certain times you just want to receive whatever bad energy that you're receiving from others, and then you just move on. Sometimes you actually want to use that energy that comes towards you, like the birds flying. You basically use that energy, push it back, and soar. So but at the end of the day, um, what we're saying here is emotional safety is not guaranteed, but emotional resilience is something that is in your control. You have tremendous amount of influence so that you develop that. Now, you tell me, Enrique, how do you think that this emotional resilience can be developed?
And I want to talk about real quick is something you mentioned there. We
Okay.
have to be careful when we're asking for a psychological safety in any situation where we are,
Mm,
because we want to also consider that if we're asking people to be something they're not, we're
mm,
asking them to be inauthentic. And I don't
mm,
think that we want a inauthentic world
mm.
for the sake of psychological safety. And so we
Yeah,
have to consider that, just like you said, there's some things that are not guaranteed, and that
yeah,
is psychological safety. It's just not guaranteed.
yeah,
But you can be resilient, just like you said, and build that,
yeah,
right? And so
yeah,
how do you build that? How do you get to a point where you can be uh, uh, in a state of awareness, a high state of awareness of yourself, to be
yeah,
able to receive whatever it is that's coming, categorize it, put it in whatever place it needs to be, and use that as a catapult for you to continue forward. And it's not easy, right? Because we don't learn everything all at once. Sometimes we have to learn certain lessons in order to get that resilience built up. I'll tell you a story. I think I've shared this before, but I was working
mm,
at a place. It was a very stressful, non psychological safety place. There was no psychological safety, but
mm,
but I was I was in a state of constant anxiety, constant fear, constant this. Everything was just constant all at the same time. Didn't know who was going to say what, when they were going to say it, and how it was going to impact me. But I do
yeah,
know one morning I went to open the door and I couldn't open the door. My body, I
mm,
lost my resiliency. I lost
mm,
it. And it was very weak to the point where now that situation was making me physically unable to move forward, not just
yeah.
mentally. Yeah, in my
No,
mind, I
this
was like, I
paralysis.
was, yeah, I was at home in my mind, but I was at work and I couldn't even go in. So, what
Mm,
did I have to do? I had to come to an awareness that, hey, Enrique, this may be a little too much for you. It
mm,
may be too much for you, and so you have to consider, all right, do you press forward and say, okay, I got this, I know my own, and these people are going to either learn to work with me or they're going to learn to be without me, one of those two, right? So
yeah,
I had to look at what was it that was triggering me in in that way, and then
yeah,
what was it that I had in my possession currently to be able to address that gap, that void that I was experiencing, in order to get me to be able to work, be able to respond in a good way to my coworkers, and get the
mm,
mission still done. And I had to
yeah,
build over by, and I was having conversations with myself.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So yeah, this is this conversation. I think it's so real that I mean, we can see like we're dealing with various different forces out in the world, um, that there's so many wrongdoings, like whatever that's supposed to mean to different people going on. But yeah, so we have people that they're on the streets cheering bloodshed, like in 21st century. We have people, I mean, like, and these are like the shadow sides to all of us human beings. Like we all have shadows, and the shadows manifest themselves quite differently in various different areas in our lives. And so we know that we're not perfect, and because we're not perfect, we're going to cause harm, sometimes really unintentionally. Now, if I know that I can actually harm myself, yeah, so we do it like in various different forms. It's not like only my neighbor or my partner or my opposite party in the political sense, or my enemy, like whatever we want to call it, and are harming us. But actually, we are capable of harming ourselves. We go through self-harm in various different forms, physically or mostly mentally. Now, if we know the very nature of how we are as human beings, our being and our integrity and our shadows to our being, then we know that we are capable of harming each other, and therefore we need to build the resilience amongst other qualities, uh, like assertiveness and courage, etc., which we are not talking about today. But we want to develop resilience so that we can withstand and we can bounce back, as we talked about. Now, how to start? I think um, the very first thing is being open in altering or transforming our worldview around this very thing, that yes, while it's it's really good that we have these benevolent causes to be more civilized, and encourage all of us to behave in such ways that we're not being offensive, etc., that's such a good motive. At the same time, knowing that there's so much subjectivity associated with it, that we cannot ensure that, for example, what I'm saying is not going to lead anyone feel offended. It's going to be mathematically impossible. So because of that, like changing that worldview, that this is what we are, this is the nature of this thing called, we call it life. It's not only me being there. So forgetting about that self-centered view, that I'm in the epicenter of the universe and everything should be the way that I want, because simply that cannot be. If you have that kind of expectation of life, ignoring this credible view, um, that life is not that, then you're setting yourself up for disappointment right from the get-go. You're playing a game that you will not going to win it. So yeah, setting that expectation comes from authentic, congruent, credible view or conception of different parts of reality. and and that on itself, like, see, the acknowledgement, the very acknowledgement of I am vulnerable like everyone else. I go through anxiety, I disclose myself through this state of mind called anxiety. I know that I don't have full control over everything and everyone and everyone's behavior and everyone's speech. Then that by itself is going to bring our attention to, okay, so what should be my response? Because that's exactly where the power resides. So going through this narrative, going through this transformation of this part of our meta content, as I call it, that's the beginning of the game. So I need to conceive that deeply, and bring my attention to what's in it for me. Well, what's in it for you is you're going to be more robust and powerful. You're going to be able to deal with that piece of reality as opposed to being delusional. So we're going to start there. And then the rest of it is basically exercising that. You're putting it in practice, creating a commitment, small but scalable commitment, um, creating, like aiming in the beginning, aiming low enough so that then you can take the leap. We don't necessarily need to come up with huge commitments around like how we want to be resilient, how we want to respond to the matters of life, right from the get-go. You don't want to take, you don't want to lift a stone that you are unable to throw it. You want to aim low enough so that you can take the leap. You make the commitment yourself, and you're going to execute, and you're going to track, and then you want to learn to what extent you had managed to be actually in action, resilient. You want to look into the instances, like let's say in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 1 month. You want to look into this in a list of these instances that you had managed to be resilient as you're tracking. But then the areas that you couldn't manage to be resilient, then you want to learn from that, and you want to refine. your commitment, and then you're going to keep going through this iterative approach, and gradually you're going to be more effective in it, and you're going to gradually gain mastery in this art of being resilient and bouncing back and not being crushed. So I didn't want to make it like a kind of a step-by-step guideline, but there is a distinction of resilience, as you know, Enrique, in the being framework in both books, Being and Human Being. There is a distinction around resilience, and there's a whole chapter on it. And also, where I was talking about the stages of building your conception and then going to this iterative approach is part of the transformation methodology, which is also described in the book. So, for those of you who are interested, you can definitely look into the Being framework and see how you can benefit from it. So, Enrique, any final thing that you would like to say before we wrap this session up?
Yeah, resiliency is something that you work on. It is a daily thing. You have to apply awareness, right? Self awareness to all you do and have an inventory, have an integrity inventory. Where has your resilience been hit and where can you shore it up? Where can you bring it back to its original state?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Enrique, and thank you very much, everyone. See you in the next one. Bye.